Hey, Leada, thanks so much for coming on today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
I've been looking forward to this because of the work that you're doing. Yes, you're a great physical therapist, and we're going to talk about
Thank
that.
you.
But there's some cool projects you've been a part of that I really want to just dive into because it's always exciting to hear what everyone else in the entrepreneurial world
Thank
is
you.
exploring and how they're leveraging their craft. So this is going to be a fun conversation. So again, thanks for hopping on today.
Of course. Stoked to share anything that I can help. I know it's always fun to talk about other things that we can do as physical therapists. So very excited to talk.
So let's lay the groundwork for the audience, our community, and just kind of give some insight into what your origin story was and how you got to where you are right now.
So most of my origin story starts like many other sports PTs. You go to grad school, outpatient, strong sports population, got my SCS, my CSCS, like was working with a pretty active population in the university, collegiate athletes, elite and higher level athletes. And then the pandemic happened. At that point, most clinics, I'm in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area, most clinics around here shut down. It was a weird time. The pandemic was weird for physical therapy. Elective surgeries were canceled, sports were canceled, and so our main population was like, unless you were in the league or whatever, you were kind of you had to shift gears or take a pause. And so at that point, most clinics shut down, and I was applying for other jobs in the waiting process because I didn't know when I would be back at my previous job. Ended up leading to a very long lull, and I was just like losing my mind waiting, honestly, because I was in such a busy clinic and I was used to working so much. And my friends are all nurses. You know, I went to PT school in a strong program that had a nursing program. My undergrad did too. So everyone was on the front lines working during the pandemic. I was like a sideline worker, and I felt like I could do more. And so that led me to just start offering free virtual sessions online for essential workers. That was my first thing that I decided to do in the meantime of not having full-time clinic work. And that turned into starting an Instagram to basically connect it to the website. I didn't actually start Instagram to do Instagram. My website had a little option. It was like link your socials. And I was like, I should probably do that. And at first it was just like a very basic Instagram with like motivational, like get PT. You can be strong. It really wasn't anything useful. And so I had to, in that time, basically look at ways to find work, make work for myself. I remember I like went to a park, sat down with a pen and paper, and I was like, what can I do virtually? You know, when you're working with patients in clinic, you're in a hands-on setting like in, sports and higher level movers, it's hard to think of what you can do without being in the same room with someone. And so I sat there and I wrote a list of things I could potentially offer in 2020. It was like April, like peak pandemic. And then I just went online. And then after having to learn the ropes of what branding was, what marketing was, which are all different things, by the way, I learned that actually most of my traffic to my website was coming from Instagram. And so I decided to put more effort there. And with that came sharing some tips and tricks along the way. It opened up doors for other connections. I actually ended up in teaching. I picked up an adjunct faculty position at the place I went to school. So I started doing that on the side. I was seeing people virtually. I actually made connections for other jobs through Instagram. And so, I mean, still pandemic was weird. It was like temp positions and flex positions, but still it led me through a lot of different settings and ultimately landing me here where I'm part time in the clinic. I have a director role, but then I'm also doing my own thing on the side and working with like the branding space and media and stuff like that. So it just was a weird road that opened up a lot of doors with a lot of just optimism and uncertainty at the same time.
It was like sink or swim. You just kind of had to figure it out,
Straight
is
up,
what I'm hearing.
straight up. Yeah.
The process of trying to figure out and like going to the park and writing down, what
Yeah.
did you write down to say, okay, this is what I can offer?
Gosh, I think I probably still have the paper somewhere, but I just thought about what my first thing was like, all right, I am in the Bay Area, so I have a lot of friends that are in tech, and I was like, ergo consults. Everyone's working from home right now, so just the basic tips and tricks that I see all the time for like the non-sports setting. So that was one. It was like ask a PT a question, like any consultation you might have. I was really strict on making sure that I like understood the legalities around it. I didn't want to. It was weird. It was a weird thing because with physical therapy, like you can only treat within the state you're licensed in. So I really wanted to make sure that was clear. Although with coaching, it's very vague. With California, so I was only taking patients in California. And so everything else was just a one-off consult, but that became a thing of, okay, I can sort of treat people, like how do I best set up a visit? Because it's just not the same when someone's not coming to you for insurance and they know they won't have 6 visits with you, or maybe they don't come here, they just want 1 visit with you. So how do you think of ways to actually make money off of that and sustain a lifetime? The other things were, God, what else did I do? There was like some coaching stuff, I think I had like a buddy fitness class for like 2 Zoom friends or something that I could just lead people through. I was reaching for things, and eventually I learned that too many options isn't a good thing either. And so I've narrowed it down. But yeah, kind of like that.
That's amazing. And just speaking from short experience too, having gone off, you want to do so much, and then you realize that's not a sustainable business model. Right? Like you learn, okay, where do I really want to double down on, and like also from like a personal enjoyment side, but also you said like what's sustainable and really going to bring in the revenue. So like I imagine every entrepreneur, I hope, has probably gone through that same process. Okay, let's take on the world. I'm one person. I can't take on the world. Let's dial it in. And it really sounds like you nailed it there. There was one fine detail you briefly skipped over, and I really want to highlight that because I think it's important. Is you got your SCS, which is your sports clinical specialist, which not many physical therapists in the country have, right? I think it's like 9 or 10% of us have that credential. Why did you feel like it was important to go down that path and become an SCS?
I was working at the time. I always wanted to stay in the sports setting more so than just active population. It's always been what felt like home base. Initially it was like between athletic training and physical therapy. Like I was this close. The only difference was the lifestyle that I need. I like couldn't. I love my ATCs, but I could not do what like I just can't. It's a lot. And so my like dream setting is outpatient affiliated with the team, with a college, with some sort of club. Like I'd love to be that reliable person that works with in conjunction with that. So that I felt like my SCS allowed me to really understand the basis of what it needs to be in that setting and to work sidelines if needed. They don't necessarily I don't think they do joint PT ATC anymore. So I think this is the closest we kind of, and so this was what basically made me feel like complete in terms of everything that I ever loved to learn, that what drove me to be a PT. And so in order to best treat this population and really communicate with the other members of this team, so with the athletic trainer, with the strength coach, with the coach, this felt like the right move. And even now, looking back, it's like the best thing I ever did for myself, I think. I remember the first time I was deciding between specializing. I knew I wanted to specialize. And of course, like many other people, it was ortho or SCS. But I always knew it was sports. And actually, one senior PT, I won't say who, but she started looking at me. She's like, doctors don't care about that. And I was like, well, I care about that. And I care because I want to learn more. And I think as a woman in sports, it's important to have a lot of you got to have your credentials and you got to have your backing. And so that's what led me to do it.
I agree. And it took me a while to get my SCS. And then before that, I always viewed as the SCS as the sports clinical specialist. I viewed it as an opportunity to get your foot in the door for sports jobs, right? I think, having gone through hiring people in sports, you realize what's going to set people apart, right? And I found that those that went through that, at least you understood that, okay, this person coming to you has some advanced understanding of the sports space. Now, that doesn't, knowledge and experience are two totally different things.
Right.
But I eventually decided to get it more from a marketing piece, right? Like the ability to say, hey, I have this advanced clinical specialist.
Exactly.
I worked in sports for so long, right? You got to play a little bit of that game too, as much as we don't want to acknowledge that in the entrepreneurial world. But hey, like I get it. Let's double click here a little bit, kind of like a little bit of the X and O's of kind of what you do from a therapy side. And then I really want to zoom back out and click on some other cool products you've been a part of. So when it comes to, physical therapy, when it comes to the sports side of things, right? Working with athletes and everyday clients, really, what is your approach to managing either the everyday client or the athlete? Are they the same, different? Like, what is your approach to the PT space?
It starts with goals for me. And it starts with what the person in front of me is ultimately trying to do and what they're trying to do right now. What's the long-term plan? what's the plan right now? And so whoever that is, whether it's an everyday, an athlete of life, as we like to call them, if it's, I like to run and I'm trying to, maybe try this one marathon coming up, but ultimately I want to be able to stay active for my whole life, versus the athlete that's like, I'm in season right now. I just tore my ACL. I could be scouted next year. I'm in high school. I would really like to get back to it so that I can play in college. It starts with the goals, and then you zoom in a little bit closer and you say, okay, what are we working with now? And I always like to give, one reason I really like my SCS is that I think everyone deserves that sort of detailed eye that we give athletes. And I think people like that depending on the person. But if there's someone that's like, look, I'm trying to do this for life, you're able to give the same level of detailed attention, the questions. You're still in season if you're in a busy season of your life, I think. And the postseason, the off season, you have offload weeks, you have deload weeks. Depending on, it could be different if you're a new dad or if you're playing club soccer. It doesn't really matter. Like, there are times where the workload is higher, and I love to find the parallels. But ultimately, it goes down to understanding the person, where their baseline is, what the injury is, what they're working with entirely, their whole background environment, what makes them a person. I'm very big on that biopsychosocial approach. I always, always ask about the other things that contribute to rehab and recovery in my first visit with someone. Sleep, stress, nutrition, it never goes not talked about. And then we get to planning, and then we get to moves of how we're going to get to the goal.
I love the phrase busy season still in season. I like
Yeah.
that. I'm gonna have to borrow that one from you.
Yeah.
Just this random question just popped in my head, and really curious as you're describing your approach and the things you're looking at, right? Some like popular influencers out there now, some podcast hosts, really
Yeah.
the buzzword I'd say over the last 3 to 5 years is longevity, right? Are you seeing an uptick in kind of that mentality from the movement and health space within your
Yes.
population you're seeing?
Oh yeah. And sometimes, I will be honest, sometimes I wonder if it's just because of where I live. I mean, California is a pretty active and healthy state, so to speak. And I know it's not the case all over the US. So I always like to give it that, like, is this really the new trend, or is it just what we're seeing? And I know you're in Arizona, I believe, right? So I think you
Yeah.
sort of see a bit of that too. But I will say the general trend is people are curious of what it takes to live longer, live healthier, move better, move more. And it's interesting with longevity as the goal. I feel like longevity for the athlete starts. It should start when you're seeing them. Like, that should be in their mind for the long term too, which is kind of hard sometimes for someone that's just worrying about getting through the season. So when you're treating someone like that, or when someone's coming to you and they're playing on a team, and they bring up, like, I'm just trying to play soccer right now, like, but what about the long term? And this is different from elite to club to just recreational. But when people are wanting to stay active, or learn how to stay active for as long as they can, it's really understanding, like, what do you know about longevity right now? Because if it's just getting through the hardest workout every single day, we need to have a talk. And we need to talk about the other things that are going to impact you, because here's what we see throughout the lifespan. Here's what might change for you, for just any human body, in 20, 30 years. And understanding where, like, your literal physical human body will be in terms of what is internally happening. How do we tailor your approach to life so that you're matching those demands of life with what you're working with? And so I feel like that's important, and it is trending, but the communication about that is important.
There's a lot of information out there. It sounds like you got a good grasp on
Yeah.
guiding your clients, guiding your patients.
Yeah.
Almost like making sure they stay on the right track and not pull too much information in, which is fantastic to hear.
Right. Yeah.
As far as like any working with the athletes, I always think it's cool, like those that have an opportunity to be in this space, because not everybody does. Although a lot of people want to have the opportunity to work with that population. Is there any cool experiences you had, work with particular athletes or working with particular teams that, like, man, this just like really resonated with me? Because, sports stories are fun to hear about. Athlete stories are fun to
Yeah.
hear about. Is there any one story that sticks to mind?
Honestly, I think it was my time with Exos in San Diego. It was 2021, January to March. It was like pro day combine prep season essentially. And I went down there. This was like when there was no work. And I ended up connecting with the manager there. Shout out to Zach. He's awesome. And he asked if I'd be interested in interviewing for the position. And then I did. And it was probably one of the highlights of maybe my career so far or my growth as a PT so far. Like I've always loved that team setting of just every single person on the team just so into what they do and so good at what they do individually that when you come together, the athlete's just getting the best care. And that is my absolute favorite because it's every athlete story is fun then. I feel like it's exciting. And so the strength coach is there, Roy, Christina, the PT, like everyone was doing such incredible work. And I felt like in my clinic and rotations before, sometimes I felt like I might have been the most excited person in the room, and I didn't like that feeling because it was nice to be around everyone that was like just equally as geeked out about trying to get everyone to their tip top shape.
Geeked out. I like to hear it. How would you describe, for those that have never worked in a team setting, right?
Yeah.
And Exos is probably the closest you're going to get to the team setting without
Yeah.
being a part of a team. I mean, Mark
Right.
Verstegen and the group, 20, 25 years ago, did a great job replicating that
So good.
model, and just
Yeah.
the ability to scale it has been fantastic. I mean, I've hired numerous
hmm
people from the Exos model. I
Yeah.
think it's a great starting space for
hmm
everyone. How would you describe, the culture in that space in comparison to, like you said, those that weren't out as high energy, geeked out as you in the other clinics?
Yeah, with a place like Exos, and this is what I think they call them their legacy facilities, and Carlsbad is, I don't think it's no longer there, but the energy there, I mean, the guys they checked in for basically this season, these few weeks that they were training and preparing, and they were staying in the local environment within the same city, either a hotel or with parents or family. And in that environment, these players are checking in the morning. They have a schedule Monday through Friday, potentially some weekends, and it's very structured. So you're working with dietitians, physical therapists, or performance therapists, strength coaches, and they're working on every single aspect of whatever's going to make them perform the best when the time comes for the combine. And in that environment, people are showing up every day. There's a special kind of motivation, I think, and discipline. I don't want to forget that. It's easy to be motivated for a day or two, but it's hard to stay disciplined throughout the whole thing. And these guys really put in the work there, and you can see it. And when you're a PT and you're trying to get someone to do their rehab exercises, it can be hit or miss depending on everyone's got stuff going on. But when someone is fully in and there. And I will say, like, just because someone's an athlete does not mean they're going to do their rehab exercises or do them with you with like being full in. But these guys were really locked in, and it just felt like everyone was there to work and do the job and do the job well.
That's amazing. It sounds like you had a great time there, and also I just
Yeah.
appreciate your perspective, and also just calling out, hey, like, just because they're athletes, that doesn't mean they need a little bit of
Yeah,
nudge and encouragement too. And I think that's a
for
big
sure.
misnomer. Like we're all human at some level, so we all
hmm
need a little bit of encouragement here and there.
Yeah.
Listen, I would love to pivot here because at this
Sure.
burning question, I really just want to dive into. You recently were a part of a program with Adidas, and you were part of designing a shoe. And I just want to ask this broad statement and just kind of just learn about, like, how did you get involved with this project, and what was that like?
So that was, yeah, Adidas was awesome. So I will say I didn't design the shoe, but I helped design the campaign for the shoe. And so these larger brands often work with marketing agencies that just like they've been working them for 30 plus years. And the agency reached out and they said, "Hey, do you work with brands?" It was very, very cryptic in an email. Yes, I do. Why? And then we got on a call and they discussed essentially the needs. And they found me online, I believe, through Instagram. I did ask them how, and they weren't, the girl that told me wasn't entirely sure. But basically, these brands and these agencies, they basically scour the internet for subject matter experts. And so I guess my name just kept popping up in certain things and certain words that were tying into the campaign. And so that's what led them to reach out to me. And so with this campaign, the Drop Set 3, it's their third iteration of the Drop Set shoe. It's a strength training, weight training shoe, not a powerlifting shoe, but something that's fit for everyone to try to get in the gym. And they brought me on to help them understand the current landscape of shoe wear as it relates to the fitness world for everybody. Like, where are we at with shoes? What shoes are people wearing in the gym? What shoes do well in the gym? What shoes ideally would be great for weightlifting and someone that was just trying to stay active for life? What would be ideal for something like this? And so I helped them pretty much understand the latest research and like the trends and just where generally people would be, where they would benefit from having a specific shoe and what details about the shoe would help. And they already had the shoe. And so like I'm grateful. It made it easy because the shoe is so well done that I didn't have to be like, pick and choose and be like, you should really emphasize this study. Like it was just a good shoe. Like they really covered all their bases. But that's basically how it came to be. And so when it came to, I mean, it's one thing to have the campaign on print and in media, and then they had a launch in New York City. And so in New York, it was all about inviting media to come try it out and have this whole experience with the shoe. And I was there. The director of product was there from Germany, and our MC, who's like the lead trainer at Tone House in New York. He was awesome. He was basically like the host. And so the energy was there. We put a lot of media experts through, or I should say reporters or editors through a workout with the shoe. And then I picked up on there was a second part of the campaign that trails off. And this is it's specifically a women's cohort with Adidas women, leading them through a summer program so that they can meet their goals, just all centered around strength training.
Super jealous of this entire experience you had. And this,
Thank you. It was awesome. It was so cool.
and it sounds it too. And like, there's just so many questions I just want to like double back on. But I just really just want to say like, hey, like that's an incredible experience. It sounds like it was great. Like low key, I was always an Adidas fan playing soccer, so it was just like as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, we got to dig into this. But like more like a little bit, cool. Like let's dive a little bit deeper on kind of like what the information you shared with Adidas, because I think this is so fascinating. The fact that they are looking for experts outside of their own business, because I think my perception is, okay, as a company, let's bring in our own experts. Let's try to guide the ship to how we want it to be. But the fact that they were externally seeking it to get advice and say, hey, no, like what's really going on? So really curious, what was some of the findings or advice that you provided Adidas when it came to the drop set 3?
I was really actually happy that they asked a physical therapist to be a part of this, because it's not always we see like a physical therapist involved with brands. It's just not a common thing. So I was stoked to even it didn't have to me, I'm just glad you asked a physical therapist. But some of the things were like we had to investigate basically heel height, millimeter drop from heel to forefoot, density of cushion, working out with barefoot style shoes or barefoot in general versus running shoes. A lot of the research looks at running shoes versus, I'm just going to call them powerlifting shoes, weightlifting shoes that have the Velcro strap and the platform. And then the other research is just, there's very few on just everyday trainers, and I should say running shoes or sneakers. And so there's very little understanding of what a cross training shoe is in the papers. It's just running shoes, platform shoes, barefoot, or just any. They don't tell you what shoe it is. And so some of the stuff they looked at with regards to strength training and performance was a shoe that is too soft, like a running shoe. There's increased workload when doing something like a Romanian deadlift or conventional deadlift, because you have that rocker sole, you sink a little bit. It's just harder to generate that power when your heel is sinking into the ground and you're trying to pull up, essentially. Shoes that have too high of a drop, like a running shoe, can change your center of gravity a little bit more when you're picking up or when you're going through a squat. The platform shoe does do well in contributing to better, we call it trunk posture, when doing something like a squat, because you get that dorsiflexion angle that changes with a shoe that has a slight heel versus completely barefoot. And so that allows people to be a little more upright, which can be helpful for the general person that's trying to perform their best under something like a barbell back squat. That's for the first time. They also found that shoes with that slight heel drop actually improve quad recruitment versus a heel that's more flat, which checks out with how we do heel elevated squats sometimes. So little things like that. And then there was the injury side of things, like how do people get injured with regards to shoe wear in the gym? And this was a tricky one because I didn't want to cherry pick studies. And so I really had to like dig deep and understand where the injuries were happening. A lot of them were overuse, or they were just incorrect shoes for specific tasks. So like running shoes or barefoot shoes in like in a weight training class, or just being barefoot in group fitness class. So it's just these barriers to equipping people for, I'll call it the task at hand. So if they're doing strength training, then it would be a lot better if they had a strength training shoe. We get running shoes for running. It would only make sense if we had it to wear a good weight training shoe for things that you're trying to generate that biggest power, those squats, the deadlifts. It's not just, doing lunges in a gym class, but like you're trying to do your heavier squat because this is going to pay off, down the line. And so here's a shoe that matches that. So it's things like that.
I love it. There were so many good points you hit there. There were so many
Yeah.
good points you hit there. And also you alluded to how some things in the weight room that you commonly see as like quote unquote
Mhm.
orthotics or shoes, right? Like you mentioned
Right.
ramps, you
hmm
mentioned
hmm
head
Yeah.
changing the position of a weight versus front versus back. Like all of that is
Right.
to the point trying to just change how you interact with the ground
hmm
and manage your center of mass and center of
Exactly.
pressure. And shoes are one way to do that.
hmm
It was interesting to hear you say like the huge heel platform weightlifting shoe that you typically
Yeah.
see in powerlifters. I had a colleague that used to always talk about heel elevated, and his was just
Yeah.
practical experience. He used to be a bodybuilder. Was like, listen, like, why doesn't everybody just squat with heels elevated? Like everybody's
Yeah.
quads are massive that ever does like powerlifting, and it's just so true because like just what that does from a
Yeah.
kinematic perspective, just from a quad
Mm,
recruitment. It's just cool to hear
It
you say that he's
kind of
found something
makes
similar.
sense. Yeah. And I think it was
Yeah, absolutely.
interesting, like the fact that it's just, you don't want to be locked into like a platform shoe when you are just someone that's trying to strength train for life. And they're big. I really enjoyed that their angle was getting everyone of all levels to get under, we'll call it the barbell, but strength training specifically. And I really appreciated that because that's what allows this wiggle room of, do you make the drop the exact same between this shoe versus a platform shoe? Do you make the forefoot to be a little bit more flexible versus another shoe? And so this allows like that natural movement. It's just like a really good shoe for someone that's trying to excel in the strength training part of their life. And I was a big fan of the way they were, just like their mission with it. Another interesting thing that I did find was a study on people's confidence levels and the shoes that they wear. And just because like one barrier to wearing a good shoe is the fact that sometimes it's ugly and people don't like to wear a shoe that's ugly. And so then they're going to pick a shoe that is maybe more appealing to them, but maybe not the best fit for them. And then that's going to affect their performance. So just basing, telling you is like, look, this is you're touching on all these trendy colors. You have great colorways. Like these are things that you can confidently sell to the, like, look, if you like this, if this makes you feel like an athlete, it might actually impact the way you and the frequency in which you're in the gym, which was funny to me.
1,000%. You will never catch me in like a Brooks Brothers or a Hoka. Just like I'm sorry, like
No,
those shoes are just
no,
no offense, and I just
no
ruined those
offense, but
brand
no.
partnerships potentially. But like you're 1,000% right though. Like it's gotta look good. It's like look good, feel good, like have some confidence to
Yeah,
yourself, right? Like I think you nailed it too. That was funny to hear you say that.
yeah.
I want to dial in a little bit more on some of the finer details, just out of curiosity.
Mhm,
The level of heel drop. You kind of
mhm,
alluded to a couple different variations, and it really just, and I don't know if you found this in the research or in the process of working with Adidas,
mhm,
right? So we have our barefoot trainers that zero heel drop, and then you have probably your powerlifting shoe, which probably has the
mhm.
highest heel drop. I don't know what, maybe 15, 20
Right.
millimeters max,
Yeah.
right?
The
So
the
in
big
between,
running and the powerlifting shoes are the thickest.
okay, so how first, I guess, did you learn what the process was from a shoe company or even just from your own experience,
hmm
how to determine who should have what type of heel drop for what type of activity? And even maybe that's too broad of a
Yeah.
stroke and we don't want to go there,
Yeah.
but just really curious if you could dial in a little bit more insight into the whole
hmm
concept of heel drop versus barefoot training.
Yeah. So from a perspective of, I mean, we can make those decisions of what might be better for the person in front of us depending on injuries, ankle mobility, calf, Achilles situations. But when it comes to something like weight training, I'm not exactly sure how they picked. I can't remember if it's a 6 millimeter. I think it's a 6 millimeter drop for the drop set. I can't remember if it's a 6 or 8. But we know that like the higher running shoes were 10 to 12 or 10 to 15 even. I think the platform weightlifting shoes were 12. And so I think they were going with something that is closer to a barefoot feel without actually being barefoot. And I don't know where the line was drawn between, and I don't think this information is out there, like what heel drop is low enough that you're still preserving those benefits of ankle mechanics and quad recruitment and trunk posture, and what's too low for something like weight training. I don't know if that's out there, but it was really just the amount of shoes that were more likely like 10 to 12 millimeters versus something that's completely barefoot. But with the reality of the barefoot shoes is they didn't want to make it a barefoot shoe because then it wouldn't make it a drop set. And if they wanted to do something that was more barefoot, it wouldn't have that heel stability, that rear foot stability. It's really, really strong in the back. That heel, I think it's a GeoFit heel cup. That's really hooks down. And it's you can't even move the back of the heel, and that rear foot stays really stable. Whereas with something like a barefoot shoe, you get a little more mobility in that rear foot and midfoot, and how it sort of can mold to the barefoot shoe. Which again, barefoot shoes have their place, but if you're someone that's trying to get in the gym and just really excel in the strength training part of your life and take it with you and generate the most power and get the strongest you can, you're going to probably want the best shoe for the job. And this checks more boxes for the everyday person that isn't that aware of what their foot sort of needs and works.
Excellent. That makes complete sense. And you hit on some points that I was hoping to hear from. And I wish there was a magic, a magic answer that said, yep, this is the magic number for heel drop for weightlifting, and this is what it is for running. We all know that's not the case, right? There's so much more that goes into it. So I appreciate just providing some color and clarity to that, because I think it's always an interesting topic, right? Should I get custom orthotics? Should I go to Runner's World and get this whole assessment? Should I go to a biomechanics lab and get an assessment? So it's just interesting to just always learn more about that space, because it is important when you talk about feet and mechanics, because it certainly can affect the entire kinetic chain. Another cool project, you have all the cool projects that I want to tap into here. Another cool project you took on was you wrote a book. And not only that, but you wrote a book titled The Science of Stretch. And I really enjoy it. One, just flipping through it, just the quality of the book is super high. The graphics are awesome. But you do a great job highlighting just basic anatomy and physiology for even the layperson to understand, which I think is super important. But I really wanted to double click here. And one, I want to talk about the process of just going through the book first off, but also then I want to peel back and I think flexibility and stretching has taken a bad rap over the years, as far as, it doesn't work, it does work. And so really just want to have a open conversation around that. But before we get into that fun stuff, what was just the process of going about writing a book, and why'd you decide to write one?
This story is so funny. So it all started with Instagram again. I didn't think I would ever say that. I didn't set out to write a book. I didn't wake up one day and was like, I'm going to write a book on stretching. That is the last thing you could have told me I would do like 5 years ago or 4 years ago or whatever. But what had happened was I got an email from a publisher. And I joked because I thought it was a scam at first, because like you get all kinds of emails when you have an email available on Instagram. It's like they asked if I would ever be interested in writing a book. And I was like, this is a scam. I'm going to ignore it. And then they sent a follow up. Said, hey, like any thought on this? Like this is who I am. This is the editor. And this is some of the other books in the setting. Like we'd love to hear your thoughts. And so I entertained the conversation. I said, all right, what are you looking at? And say, hey, we have a practical fitness series called The Science of. It's part of DK Books. We've already done, because at first my mind was like, well, I hope it's strength training, because I have a bias, right? And I'm like, I think everyone should strength training. I should write about that. But they already had that. So they had running. Shout out to Austin Kern, who wrote that book. Phenomenal. Science of strength training had been done. Science of running, science of yoga, Pilates. They were great. And I asked them why stretching. They just wanted to highlight that next. And at first I told them I would think about it. I wasn't sure, because like you said, stretching has just been through the ringer over the last 30, 40 years. It was everything, and then it was nothing, and then it was something, and then it depends, and then it just turned into mobility. So it was interesting. And so I finally accepted the book because I realized how many questions all of us PTs get on a daily basis about stretching. Like every single one of our friends has asked us about stretching. Which stretches do I need to do? I just need to do some stretches, don't I? I'm injured because I didn't stretch, huh? Like I swear to God, if I had $1, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So I decided to do it because I just realized how little people know about stretching, but I also called myself out on my own biases, because myself, I was like, do I need to do that? Like stretching is kind of whatever, right? And so I caught myself for being comfortable in my own bias. And I was like, you're going to dig into this and you're going to clean up what's actually out there and put it in a succinct sort of book so that just anyone can take this and then do what they want to do with it. It's like no one has to do the splits by the time they finish the book, but I just wanted people to know how to use it, if they should use it, and where it would fit, so that please, in the end, you're just moving more. In a nutshell.
1,000%. And I commend you on just being able to take your,
Yeah.
call yourself out and be like, you know what, let me check my
Yeah.
own biases. And
Yeah.
no better way to check your own biases than write a book. That's for sure.
Yeah. That was tough.
So from let's answer some of those questions, or maybe
Mm.
let me reflect that back onto you and say, hey, what were the big questions that you felt like you needed to answer within the book?
I joke that you can tell a physical therapist wrote the book when you flip through it because it's like all the questions that we got. And so the first was, of course, injury reduction, because we know the prevention piece is a little bit tricky, but general injury prevention, what that looks like, and how stretching plays a role, if it plays a role, when might it play a role, or rehab or pain management, this kind of thing. Understanding pain had to be in there for me because I know people are probably going to pick up this book because they have pain. And I was like, hold on, before we get into that, let's just talk about it. Let me give you the backstory. Let me make this as concise as possible. So understanding pain and theories of pain was important. How joints move, of course, basic anatomy, muscular function, all that's in there. Just like there's very brief, basically like a mini anatomy physiology book in the first chunk of the book, where you're talking about how muscles work, what sorts of is length tension, is that a theory? Can we base everything off of it? And then I also wanted to talk about how the body might change with age and tie that into physical activity guidelines. That was a must have in there, was what we're generally aiming for. Because again, people often pick up stretching and they think that's enough for whatever sort of, like, I'm active, I stretch every day, and that's just not right. That's just not enough for most cases. And so that had to be in there, physical activity guidelines. What does that look like? What is fitness? How does stretching, does flexibility play a role in fitness? And basically, how much do we weigh up these things on the grand scheme of what's important for us to live healthy, long lives at this point with what we know? And so understanding how the body changes and where, does stretching be more appropriate for someone that was older versus younger? What can I do for an athlete? Oh, I like to run, or I like to do martial arts, or I like to dance. What does this matter for me? How might it help me? So really just, I call it like a companion for an active lifestyle. It's not a guide. It's just supposed to ride with you and it'll give you tips and tricks, but ultimately it's supposed to empower people to make those decisions on their own.
What was the hardest question you struggled to answer within the book from your own questions?
That's a good question. Ooh. I I think the hardest one was the benefits of stretching, because that needed to be its own spread for the sake of the style of the book. And that one was hard for me to check my own biases and be like, look, it can go beyond range of motion. It doesn't necessarily need to be there. And so zooming out and be like, all right, so stretching, like whether it's static or dynamic, like what interesting things have we found with it? Or even if it's in a small population, we can still talk about it, but just note that it's some people and some studies have seen. And so some of that was hard at first, because sometimes the way the spreads are, they have like, you almost need to fill in. I had an outline and I had a guide of what I was going to talk about, but then the spread comes and you're essentially filling it in. And so there were all these circles that I had to talk about, these benefits of stretching. And I was like, oh, I got to find another one. But what else is there? What else is there? So I really had to dig deep and explore different papers and make sure that they were strong enough to even note.
Were there any myths, or maybe myths? This can be two questions. Let's go with,
Yeah.
when it came to things you learned from your own biases that you flipped on. It's like, oh wow, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
There's enough for me to flip on this, or yeah, you know what? I think I may have been wrong or need to change my perspective on this.
I think one of the big ones was stretching doesn't improve performance. That was an interesting one because I think it all depends on how you ask that question or the statement that you say. Because what kind of stretching? What kind of performance? What sport? What movements? And so I think there's just more layers to it before we just chalk up all stretching doesn't impact performance, because there's some dynamic stretching that can impact jump performance or running performance. And if there's a sport that requires high levels of flexibility, gymnastics, jujitsu, martial arts, anything where you're like having a leg somewhere else, like really high, if you need that level of flexibility, then using static stretching to achieve said flexibility before the session might, especially for people that have increased mobility, if we know that static stretching is a little bit better at improving those end ranges, And that might actually improve your performance if you're going into, say, ballet or whatever afterwards. So I think it depends on the way we say. We have to be careful when we say it's like it's not useless, but it just depends. And what level of improvement are we looking at? Because it might be helpful. And I think that was one that was hard to communicate because I only have so many words I can use in the book. It's like word count. And I was like, oh, I think there was so many times where I wrote more than I could actually include in the book. And so when the spread came back, I was like, hold on, you're missing a may, and that needs to be in there. And you need to include this sentence. I was, oh, it was so tough. But that was probably one of the trickier ones.
It certainly is, and I appreciate you saying it's it depends like exists everywhere in medicine and
Yeah.
performance and physical therapy because right context drives so much of decision process,
Yeah.
the decision making process. So I appreciate
Yeah.
you highlighting that. We can't just blanket
Yeah.
and say stretching doesn't improve performance. It's like,
Yeah.
no, you're right. Like what sport, what population? I mean, the first one that comes to mind with the recent Paris Olympics was, I mean, flexibility is incredibly important in the sport of
Right.
gymnastics. Probably less
Exactly.
important maybe in the sport of sprinting because you're just in a straight line, right? So
Hmm. Yeah.
context matters, right? And sometimes
Yeah.
too much mobility is a bad thing, too much flexibility is a bad thing, and vice versa, right?
Right.
So the
Yeah.
context and how you define performance. So thank
Yeah.
you for highlighting that.
Yeah,
How about
there's a lot.
what about you talked about, checking your own bias and something that you may have flipped
Hmm.
on, but maybe there's like a common question as a therapist you may have gotten over the
Hmm.
years or a common
Yeah.
perception or let's just call it a myth around
Hmm.
stretching. Throughout the research of the book and writing the book, was there any
Yeah.
myth busters you came across?
Yes. There was one that kind of surprised me was stretching, and this kind of goes in line with what we were talking about with how you describe it. The injury prevention piece or that reducing injury risk. We know that stretching alone, doesn't matter what kind, is not enough to prevent all cause injury. Like it's not going to save you from a potential ACL tear. Like we know that. But we know also that it might help protect against musculotendinous kind of injuries and strains. So that's where I think some of that gets a little bit muggy. And, I say that with a caveat that it's that alone is never enough to prevent injury. Injury prevention is so multifactorial. And so it needs to be multimodal in the way you approach it. And so I think that's a big part in my book was like, dang, I got to say that it actually might help against strains, but also there's more to it so that you don't just rely on this. You just know how to weigh it up or down in your approach to staying active with minimizing injury risk. So that was one.
There was a couple times in the last few minutes you said the phrase injury prevention, and I
Yeah.
feel as though that is
That's,
a hot topic within
oh yeah.
what's
And
a
I don't
hot
even like
that's a
saying
hot
that.
take.
And I don't even mean injury prevention. I think in the book it says injury reduction. I just, for this purposes, I'm saying interchangeably, but it's never prevention. It's never prevention, I think.
And that's like right, like so you say that word, and like people have the visceral reaction that you just had.
Yeah,
The listeners that
I
can't see, or
know.
is like you were just like crawling in your chair, is like, oh, injury
I
prevention. I
know.
can't get on board with that, right? But to that point though, like that is a marketable phrase. You
Yeah,
talk, early in the
yeah,
conversation, you talked about SEO and marketing like that. That hits with the general public.
right,
So
right.
I just really wanted to just double click on that phrase, injury prevention. Let's leave it
Hmm.
at injury prevention. What does that mean to you?
For me, it means minimizing injury risk and understanding that injuries can happen for sometimes no good reason, and we can't exactly put our finger on it. And so just understanding that the reason why I stray away from using prevention when talking with patients is because I've seen what happens when someone hooks or like hangs their hat on that word. And when all of a sudden everything they did in their injury prevention, I say that with finger quotes, like list of things, mobility, stretching, whatever it is that they found, and they get injured, then what? Like they supposedly did everything right, right? And so that's why I try to stay away from that. Or if I mention it I think in the book it says injury risk reduction. And then in that paragraph below, they say, look, while we can't prevent all injuries, we can do our best to minimize risks and stuff like that. So really, the reason why I try not to use that word is because I've seen what happens when you do and the injury happens. And then someone has to navigate the mental space of what went wrong, what they did wrong, you get into that psychosocial component, I think. And that's a lot harder to undo
Absolutely.
than just calling it risk reduction.
Injury prevention sounds great. Excuse me, tongue
Oh,
twister there.
no.
Sounds
Yeah.
great, but injury risk reduction is definitely probably the more injury risk
Yeah.
mitigation I've seen.
Right.
Right, trying to just eliminate those. So we talk about injury risk reduction and injury risk
Yeah.
mitigation. What have you found to be most successful when it comes to though controlling for that?
Controlling for using the word or just in general for injury?
Yeah, let me rephrase that question. Great.
Yeah.
When it comes to injury risk reduction, what have you found to be most powerful to enhance the injury risk reduction process?
I hate saying this all the time, but it depends on the athlete. um, I think it really depends on what you're working with, and everyone's going to have a different caveat. Like for some people that are seemingly doing everything right, I'm training on my schedule, I'm eating all the, what my dietitian's telling me. I'm I'm training with the team, I'm doing this, but they're not sleeping well. Their biggest thing might be just working on sleep. So it really depends on the person. For the population, I see more often than not in just general active population, it's usually fully understanding load management is my big one, and understanding that load management exists outside of the gym and outside of exercises too. The mental workload is going to take a toll on what you're able to output in the gym, and understanding that is, I think, one of the biggest game changers for injury reduction, with the idea of you're in this for the long haul. When you're training for a sport or a game and you're working on injury risk reduction there, you might weigh some other things differently, like training schedule and what you're eating or eating. But I think for the average person, the biggest takeaway is for me that I see often is load management in all senses of the phrase.
Load management, another hot button we could
Yeah.
we could just
Gosh.
pull the lever on all these hot buttons right here. Well, let's put a pin in that one
Big
because
one.
I want to ask you this question, and it's more of a hypothetical
Yeah.
question, and I don't know if we'll ever get there as an
Yeah.
industry, but what do you think it's going to take to truly predict or prevent injury?
Man, it's really hard. I don't know. Really, I think we're going to have to understand who we're trying to prevent injury in order to fully build up our arsenal of things that prevent injury in that person. I think it depends on their age. We're going to have to get, I don't know if this biometrics the right word to use. Like I don't even know, but really getting down to the nitty-gritty of the person and trying to expand that to, I think, a greater population. And that's really hard to do, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, it's the Moneyball question in professional sports.
Yeah.
It's like, hey,
I don't
like
know.
how do
How do
you
you
collect all you I mean, you collect all this data. I mean, the hardest thing, right? And I think this is
Yeah.
where I think there's a shortcoming in professional sports
Right.
is that you have
Yeah.
roster turnover. And the hardest part with
Yeah.
any sort of data set is you just need consistent data collection on the same sample
Yeah.
on the same people, and they rinse and
Hmm.
repeat, just monitor things over time. So that's why
Right.
you really only ever get to that space when you have athletes that have been a part of the roster for a long time, same
Yeah.
organization, which nowadays players aren't doing that. They're bouncing from team to team, like the likes of a
Yeah.
Kobe staying with the same team or a Dirk
Yeah.
staying with the same team in the NBA. It's just hard. So, from a
Yeah.
prediction and prevention side, I think you're right. Like it definitely comes down to more the biometric side, and where I'm hopeful at is sports technology that only used to exist in professional
Yeah.
sports is becoming more mainstream and affordable for the private
Right.
sector, and you're starting to just these companies are now really these tech companies that provide us
Right.
this sports equipment. Like just think about like the basic force plates, right?
Yeah.
How many clinics now have force plates beyond the sports team,
So
and
cool.
the
Yeah.
amount of data they're able to collect. Like I imagine and I'm hopeful that, hey, knock
Hmm.
knock vault and Hawkins
Right.
Dynamics, like there could be some really creative research that comes
Yeah.
out of, hey, like what are we seeing across
Yeah.
gender, across age, across population? Like are there things that we can do from that large data set to say, hey, this is what we're seeing? And I can hear all the
Exactly.
sports scientists, chirping like, not everyone tests the same way and not everyone measures the
I
same
know.
way. And it's like,
I
yes,
know.
yes. And like, we got to start somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Like we're lucky enough to have some of the vault equipment in our private clinic that I work at, and the normative values are great, but I have a 16-year-old lacrosse player, and then I have a 21-year-old basketball player, and then I have a 14-year-old field hockey player. Like how you still have to, we have so much work to do. And then across genders, like, don't even get me started on how women and sports have historically had different opportunities. And we have so much work to do. But yeah, like you said, we do have to start somewhere. So the things that we can control, I think we can work there, maybe start there with strength and preparation and periodization and understanding where things go and how people are trained and what they're, what are how strong do you have to be for your sport, like whatever it is. But I think we have a lot to go to really chalk it up to this will prevent at best for your age group and your sport.
It's really hard to do, and the person that can get there, or the person that can sell out the most, is going to be the one sitting on a private island with a couple margaritas by their side and just hanging out.
Yeah. For real.
You've been super gracious with your time, and you've entertained all of my wonderful questions that I was really keen to learn on, because there's just so many cool products you've been a part of that not many physical therapists get to be a part of. So thank you so far. So before we wrap things up, I always love to just kind of double click on two questions. This idea and concept of finding small wins, right? Because your big wins were cool. You got to write a book. Hey, you got to be a part of, Adidas launch campaign. You've been a part of some really cool sports opportunities, right? But along the way, you had to, I imagine, endure the process, right? And finding the wins to keep you going. What does a small win mean to you?
A small win 4 years ago for me might have been just getting through the week with a very high caseload and feeling like I had the energy to still cater to myself and whatever I wanted to do for the weekend. But now it depends. Like, am I looking at, God, here I go again. It depends. If I'm looking at it through an entrepreneur lens or a PT lens, that's a really good question. One small win that I always like to include in these talks is about social media. And if one person I interact with online, whether in messages or in comments, is inspired to go give physical therapy a chance or another chance, or feels less fearful about not understanding their injury, that's a small win for me, truly. And that's why I'm even came on here, or in terms of Instagram, is because I just want to take the fear factor out of physical. So many people, everyone could use physical therapy for something. It's whether it's serious or not. And just not a lot of people, I think, give it a shot or understand it. And that's changing because people are more into longevity now and they're interested in the ways to think. But I think that's a small win for me. And another small win would be finishing through a project that I set up for myself in the entrepreneur space, whether it's launching a t-shirt or something for dog adoption campaign to help raise awareness, or it's content creation, even if it's just within a time frame, for me is honestly a small win, because that's one thing I've learned is you really can't plan for life. You can do your best to plan for life, but life just happens, especially I think after the pandemic. So just being able to take what comes and check something off of your to-do list within 2-3 months is a solid step to just keeping the ball rolling. It's very abstract.
Finishing a project is definitely a hard thing for me too. So I appreciate that. What like through all the advice you've put out on Instagram, right? You've done a great job and very active there, right? When it comes to the idea of people that want to need physical therapy, never done it before, but they want to take that first step towards upgrading something part of their health, something a part of their performance. What advice do you routinely give folks?
I would say I usually guide people to understanding what to expect in physical therapy, for one. Because a lot of times, if they've never even interacted one, like, hey, what can I expect at my first physical therapy visit? And obviously that might vary based on the clinics you go to. So I usually tell them hey, you might come across a PT that's insurance based, or that's cash pay. Here's how those visits generally play out. They should ask you about your goals. They should empower you to do something on your own. They should not make you feel broken. Communication should be a priority. Little things that should facilitate a really positive encounter or patient experience. I try to make sure that they know, so that they can maybe pick a better PT that works for them and their learning style. But that's kind of the first stop when I go to that. Before I talk about oh, well, this is your injury, here's what you might expect XYZ coming up for that. But generally, it's about the PT experience.
The communication part is key, isn't it?
Yeah, big time.
How you spin something and shed a positive light onto it is an art to it. It's not as simple as just
really
highlighting everything they're good at or bad at. I mean, we've all had those experiences with either other practitioners from other industries, or Dr. Doom. There's this one doctor in my career, players like, oh, here comes Dr. Doom, just gonna lay on all the bad stuff for me. It's like, then you got to like come in and be like, pat him on the back and say, it's okay,
Damage
you're not broken.
control.
Yeah.
Man. That
Oh,
really
this was
sucks. Yeah.
it's hard. It's hard to manage that. And again, not everybody has it, and that's okay. Like there's like, but hey, like
Yeah.
those folks that, communication is not the strong point. I promise you, they're great technically at something else, right? So we all have our ups and downs. So there's no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
Want to finish up here with just some fun questions, just to give a little more insight into your personality, because you definitely have this fun, bubbly personality about you. Of course. What was being a part of sports, being a part of the athletic space? Was there any sporting event, fan or as an employee, let's say, that you were a part of that was one of your favorite of all time?
That's a good question. Ooh, that's tough. Can't decide between football, soccer, or gymnastics. I know those are all very different. Man, I think football. Football was really fun. I feel like you get to see a lot of different personalities with football, and gymnastics is pretty serious, and those girls are incredible. The guys are too, but sometimes you get like I guess depending on the environment, some of the football guys were absolutely hilarious, and you could just joke around while also staying on track. And that was probably one of the more fun. If you can have fun in the space while like really doing good work, it's unlike anything else, I think.
What would you say football or gymnastics are also your favorite type of athlete to work with?
I really like gosh, that's tough. With sports, I really like working with gymnasts. Are hard workers. Gymnasts are really tough. They are. Gymnasts and ballerinas are some of the hardest workers I have ever seen. And I guess, yeah, man, I don't know. I don't know if I could pick one. They're all so great to work with, but it really, like with age groups, oh, I can't pick. I do like working with teenagers though. I think like late teens are really fun because they're just tapping into their strength, they're motivated, their future isn't totally set yet. And so whether that's soccer, dance, football, they're in it and they're like, I don't know, like tell me what to do, and they're totally with it. So they're fun.
It's like they've got enough development, but they're not fully molded yet, so you still get to have some fun with that. I totally share that. So I remember I started my career working in the professional youth academy in soccer, and the U16, U18
So
guys were like, okay, like we can do some creative stuff in the gym or on the field because you're kind of physically developed, but also to your point, like there's just still so much so much you could get done because there was motivated.
Yeah.
Listen, this was great. You were super insightful. I love the conversations around the sports PT. Really loved learning about the book process, everything about stretching. And then, just the project you had opportunity to be within Adidas was super interesting. So thank you for sharing everything.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Where can folks get in touch with you if they want to reach out, connect, learn? Where's the best way to connect with you?
Probably most commonly Instagram at DrMalekPT, Dr. Malek PT. You can find me there. I'm also on Pinterest, on Threads, on TikTok a little bit, a lot less than Instagram, but email is also available too. Feel free to reach out, DM, either one. Usually I might be slow, but I do respond.
I will attest she does respond. That's why she's here. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on today. This was a fun conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It was really good to talk to you. I think there's so much that everyone can learn just from between PTs and experiences and I think there's so much that PTs actually can end up doing with their skill set beyond the clinic setting. And it's just fun to talk about it.
I agree. There's so much more we can do.